All right, hi everyone. Welcome to today's Methods Hour. Very excited. We've made it almost through our whole semester of presentations. Today is our last presentation of the fall term. We will be back in the winter term though. We're currently collecting dates now. So if you have some fun methodological venture, tidbit, discussion, anything you'd like to share or lead, please be in touch with me. I'd love to include you on the schedule. Remember, these don't have to be lectures or necessarily well-developed ideas. They certainly can be, but even if you have something you're kind of struggling with or thinking through and you'd like to have some feedback about it, that's also a perfect thing to bring to Methods Hour. So please, like I said, please reach out if you have any interest in that, and keep an eye out on an updated schedule for the winter term from me, because like I said, this is our last one here for the fall. And what a last one it will be. Today we have Dr. Daniel Weissman. He's a professor of psychology. He's in the cognition and cognitive science area. He studies attentional control, how people cope with distractions from both a behavioral and a neural perspective, incorporating a lot of cool physiological as well as MRI, EEG techniques into his work. Widely published in all the places we all want to be published in. Psychonomic Bulletin and Review is an article or work from an article in there he'll be talking about today. He's published in Neuroimage, Nature and Neuroscience, PNAS. He's received several federal grants for his work, received several awards, including being named a fellow of the Association for Psychological Science. Many of us have worked with him or chatted with him or learned from him in some capacity. And so we're really lucky to have him here today talking to us about his recent work on response force. So Daniel, take it away.
Wow, well, that's a very kind introduction, and I appreciate that. For that alone, I'm glad I came. For those of you also with your cameras on, I really appreciate it, because talking into the void is hard, so I like seeing your faces of Hannah, Phoebe, Alex, Natasha, and Adrian. If others want to turn on their cameras, I'd even be happy if you make faces at me, you know, like during my presentation. It just keeps it real. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about online continuous tracking of response force and what I think we can learn by studying the journey, as I call it, of the keypress. And this is about a 30-minute presentation, and then I'd really love to have some conversation with you about what it all means and what we can do with this sort of measure. So let's see. So, as many of you are probably familiar with, cognitive psychology aims to provide a functional description of the processes and representations that underlie performance. We usually ask subjects to perform some kind of cognitive task, like tell me if two letters are the same or different by pushing one of two buttons. And we measure things like how quickly they push a button, that would be response time or RT, and how accurately they push the button, that would be error rate or ER. And we use these measures to test hypotheses about the underlying processes and representations. That is, the processes and representations that underlie task performance. And using this approach, people try to develop models of cognition. So this is a very detailed model of face recognition that Bruce and Young developed in the 80s that included all sorts of things, like not only like how do I recognize somebody's face, but also kind of are emotional expressions different than non-emotional expressions, and like how do I recognize people from different points of view? Do I have view-centered descriptions or view-invariant descriptions? And this is a very, very detailed model. Later it was supplemented with some neural evidence, eye movement evidence like gaze analysis, but much of this was from behavioral work. We also use these dependent measures, reaction time and error rate, to develop models of the underlying processes. So this is an example of a drift diffusion model that Ratcliffe developed in the 70s. And the idea here is that as people are trying to make a decision, say between one of two alternatives in a given trial, like are these two stimuli the same or different, or am I seeing an X or an O, that decision, that evidence accumulates toward a particular decision. And when enough evidence accumulates, say toward a leftward decision boundary, the subject responds by pressing the left key. So, or if decision accumulates toward a rightward decision boundary, then evidence, the subject would hit the right key. And this might be from an experiment. I say leftward and rightward because this might be an experiment where subjects are told, you're going to view some dots and they might be moving coherently to the left or to the right. And whenever you decide which direction they're moving in, push the left or right button. So you kind of reach these left or right decision boundaries, and then you make a response. So we use RTs and error rates to make models as well. But I want to ask today, as others probably have asked in many other contexts, but are we missing something by just focusing on reaction time and error rate? And the reason I ask this is, as Adrian mentioned, I have a background in cognitive neuroscience, and RT and error rate only index the endpoint of neurocognitive processing, right? But a lot of cognition happens between when the stimulus onsets on the screen and when subjects press the button. And all we're measuring is, when subjects press the button with RT and error rate. And there's a large space here between stimulus onset and the button press. So today, I'm just going to focus on the idea that response-related activity actually evolves continuously over time, rather than abruptly when there's enough evidence to cross a response threshold, as in that drift diffusion model that I presented a moment ago. And this raises the question of whether we can learn more about cognition by assessing response activation continuously, rather than only with the final button press. And that is, I like to say it this way, can we learn more by measuring the journey of a key press, right? Not just where it ends up. So people have already done this to a large extent and shown that two responses can be active even when a task requires only one. So if you think about mouse tracking and reach tracking studies of selective attention tasks, like the flanker task pictured here, where subjects indicate, say, the direction in which a central arrow points, left or right, while ignoring distracting flanking arrows that can point either in the same direction in a congruent trial or in the opposite direction in an incongruent trial like you're seeing here. What people have found in these mouse tracking and reach tracking studies is that as people move the mouse or move their arm to reach toward a left or right box indicating the direction in which the central arrow points, there's a deviation toward the left in this example. And that suggests that the flanker arrows have partly activated, to some extent, the left response. And so the curvature in this path that you're seeing in these dashed lines here is kind of showing that the hand deviates toward the left before it actually goes to the right, suggesting, again, that these distractors were processed up to the level of the response and producing some activation. Now, using these sorts of measures, it's also true that we can divide the response into different time periods. So we can think about the initiation time, that is, the time after the stimulus comes on the display until the time, for example, when the subject lifts their finger off of the starting point. And then we can divide the response time into that initiation time when the subject kind of lifts their finger as if they've decided what they're going to do. And then into the movement time, where here, once the finger is lifted, they then have to move it either to the left or to the right. Okay? And here's that curvature I showed you before, and people measure things, besides initiation time and movement time. They measure things like, what's the area under the curve, right? So like, how far do they deviate? Or what's the maximum deviation here from the ideal trajectory, right? They should have just reached right to the right, but they deviated. What's the maximum? So we can get these interesting measures that we can't get from the pure button press. And we can also divide the entire response time or response-related processing, right, within the response time measure into the initiation time and into the movement time. And you might think, well, does any of this matter? Why should I care? Well, it turns out that these different aspects of response-related processing have different developmental trajectories. So here's a study by Erb and Markovich in 2018. And what you can see is that if you just measure response time with a button press, and this was a hand reaching hand tracking study, reaching study, what you see is that 6 to 8-year-olds have these really large congruency effects, like large flanker effects, whereas 10 to 12-year-olds and 18 plus have much smaller effects. You see the same thing in terms of initiation time. So the congruency effect in initiation time is larger in 6 to 8-year-olds than in 10 to 12 and 18-year-olds. But in curvature, you actually see that the 10 to 12-year-olds no longer look like the adults. They kind of halfway between the kids and the adults, suggesting that this measure of response-related processing has a different developmental trajectory than this measure, initiation time. It's developing more slowly, and these 10 to 12-year-olds haven't yet achieved the adult status that they have with initiation time. Here's another study. This was an aging study comparing young adults to older ones. And here they found the flanker effect was larger in older adults than in younger ones. But interestingly, this was true for initiation time only. When they looked at movement time, there was no age-related difference. And so again, this allows us to dissociate different aspects of response-related processing and show that they have different developmental trajectories. So I think studying this sort of thing is kind of interesting and provides an additional window into how the response evolves over time that the pure button press, doesn't provide. But I was thinking about these a couple years ago, and kind of for my own selfish purposes, because I do studies where I think people are predicting ahead of time what response they're going to make. And so I wanted to track anticipatory response activation before an actual stimulus appeared. And it turns out that moving a mouse, I've gone to Chris Erb's lab in Auckland, New Zealand. I was there just before the pandemic. And I had to come back, and they closed the borders, and the whole plane ticket was canceled. It was like a big mess. It was kind of fun, actually. But I was there using his reach tracking device. And what I found was that moving my hand was kind of effortful to anticipate, where the stimulus would happen. Also, moving a mouse, if you just put your hand on your mouse, you'll find that even if you're thinking it's going to be left or right, it's kind of effortful to move the mouse left or right. And so I have noticed this, and I was thinking, what other, I might need something else, right, besides these kinds of measures. Another limitation of reach tracking and mouse tracking is that you can measure the difference in activation between two responses, like left and right, but not the activation of each response. And that's because you only have one hand, right? It's moving left or right. Maybe it deviates to the left before it goes to the right. But you can't measure left and right separately. What you're measuring is the net activation of the left and right response. If there's more activation of the left response, your hand moves left. If there's more of the right response, your hand moves right. But each response might be active simultaneously, and it's the kind of subtraction or the net that determines where the hand goes. And I wanted to measure, each response separately, and so I thought these measures might not give me that. This is, by the way, the same thing is true for things like the lateralized readiness potential in EEG studies, which measures the difference in activity between left and right motor cortex, but not necessarily the activation of left and right responses independently. Although I guess if you do some Laplacian analyses, you can get a little bit better at that. It's also challenging to measure the time course of response activation separately from multiple fingers on the same hand. Okay, so if you're trying to use EMG, for example, electromyography, you'd put some electrodes on the muscles of your hand, the subject's hand, like here and here maybe, and you might be able to measure something related to this index finger. But the middle finger has muscles very similar, very close, and so it'd be hard to get two adjacent fingers to separate the dipoles. With TMS, you have similar problems of separating adjacent fingers. You might be able to get away with index finger and pinky finger, but being able to measure, precisely exactly those fingers is hard. And functional MRI is also difficult, isolating in the motor cortex exactly where these adjacent finger representations are. It might be done with some sort of MVPA, but it'd be relatively complicated and certainly very expensive. So I looked at this and I said, you know, I need something else. And there's a long history in cognitive psychology of using force-sensitive devices. These started with things like squeeze devices. Gabriele Gratton and his colleagues at the University of Illinois, they called them dynamometers. And they did flanker tasks, and they had people squeeze a left device or squeeze a right device, and they found that people would squeeze the wrong device in incongruent trials just a little bit, you know, kind of things like this. And I thought, that's really cool. Maybe I could use some dynamometers. But then I thought, no, for this anticipatory response activation, I kind of want to see what's going on before the trial starts, and maybe squeezing my hand is kind of effortful, you know. And then I thought, well, most of the time we use keyboards. And keyboards are cool because, first of all, subjects are used to them. And second of all, gravity is kind of pulling your fingers down on the keys anyway, so it exerts a little more pressure, isn't so effortful if you're anticipating a particular stimulus. So I spent about 1.5 years developing my own force-sensitive keyboards, because my first instinct was to go to Amazon.com and be like, who sells these things? I'll just buy them. But it turned out that apart from a couple of computer gaming companies which had inferior products, nobody did. So I was like, what am I going to do? I know, I'm going to build my own, which actually is an exaggeration because I got folks in the shop to help me, you know, our machine production shops, things like that on campus. This is just a picture. So here what I've done is to put the F, G, J, K, and N keys from kind of space them out like they're spaced out on a normal keyboard so that they could be used here. This is like a fake escape key and a spacebar key. They're not force sensitive, but each of these keys is the F, G, J, K, and N. And the way it works is you can see in the internal view that when you push down on one of these keys, there's a strain gauge, and the strain gauge is a piece of metal that bends in proportion to how hard you're pushing. And how far it bends determines how much current will flow down that strain gauge, going to this amplifier, going to this rugged Arduino microprocessor, and then going into MATLAB and feeding into basically the experiment that I've programmed in MATLAB, and so I can save out that data. You might also notice these other wires coming out of the front part of the strain gauges. These are just recording digital responses. That is, was the key pressed all the way down or not? And that also goes into the microprocessor. So we get the same measure of RT and error rate that we do from a normal study, but we're in addition getting all these continuous kinds of measures about how hard people are pushing the key at any given moment. I just want to emphasize that doing this, I did this because anticipatory movements, I think, are a lot more likely on a keyboard. And my subjects in my experiments often come out saying, I feel my fingers moving, I'm predicting what's going to happen next. And so that was a large motivation. When I do some of my experiments, I feel the same thing too. So I was like, there's got to be something here. Here's just a demonstration of how they work. So basically, you can see the signal is hovering around 0 right about now. And I'm going to stick my finger in here in a second. And if I just barely touch the key, you can see the signal goes up. It's very sensitive. And moreover, it goes up and goes down really quickly. So I know exactly when they're pushing the key and when they're not pushing the key. Here's a full press. And you can see, like, when I push it all the way down, that's huge. But when I just push it slightly, it's very, very small. So I'm able to measure very, very subtle changes in response pressure using this keyboard. So they're sensitive to about less than a gram, about a gram, I'd say, of mass, which corresponds roughly to a centinewton. I'm polling at 200 hertz, so I get 200 measures of force on all 5 keys at the same time. This is very reliable, so if you put standard weights on each key, you get the same output from, the same measure from each key every time you put the same weight on it. The readings change really quickly with force. So like on your cell phones, those have capacitive sensors, and those, if you push it down, it kind of goes, the force level reading goes back down very gradually. Whereas these, as you saw, go down immediately. So it took me a while to figure out which exact sensors would be ideal. I got Ellis and AIT to help with developing some software to synchronize the measurement of force with when the stimuli came on the screen. Like I said, this records digital key presses, and it makes a sound. These are cherry keys. So just like a keyboard, when you push the key down, it makes a sound. These actuate and make a little click, which I think makes it more realistic for the subject. And unlike mouse tracking, reach tracking, EMG, or EEG, you can really easily measure multiple finger-specific response activations on the same hand all at the same time and get a sense of which finger is the subject starting to push down now. How about now? How about now? Is it changing across a trial? And we can do this, importantly, even before a stimulus comes on the screen, as well as, of course, afterwards. So you can distinguish between anticipatory kinds of response activation versus reactive response activation after the stimulus appears. Okay. How am I doing, by the way? Are there any questions so far? Or am I going too fast, too slow? Doing okay? Okay, well, if you think of something, let me know. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an example. This was the paper that Adrian asked me to send, a kind of background paper. And I'm going to give an example of how I've been applying this in my own work. So I've been using, in the study we published in that paper, a kind of modified what we call prime probe task. It's kind of a strange name, but what happens in this task is subjects see two stimuli. We call the first one a prime and the second one a probe. And in congruent trials, they're essentially the same stimulus, just twice, like a right arrow for the prime and a right arrow for the probe. So they're the same. In incongruent trials, they're different. So the prime might be an up arrow and the probe might be a down arrow. And as you can see here, in congruent trials, the two arrows point in the same direction. And in incongruent trials, they point in different directions. Okay? And I want to point out that to avoid kind of repetitions of stimuli and responses that produce confounds in these sorts of experiments in the literature and the field that I work in, we always alternate between horizontal arrows in odd trials, like left and right arrows, and vertical arrows in even trials. So even though we tell subjects, if it points right, push the G key. If it points left, push the F key. If it points up, push the U key. If it points down, push the D key. They're only ever seeing in odd trials of each block left and or right arrows. So trial 1, trial 3, trial 5, it's all horizontal. And trial 2, 4, and 6, it's all vertical. I just want to mention this because this will come up again later in the talk. But for now, you can see that we have both congruent and incongruent trials. And in this task, we tell subjects to respond to each arrow within 800 milliseconds after it appears. So this first prime arrow appears, and they have to respond by hitting the G key in this example to indicate that it points right. And then after this probe arrow appears, they respond again. In this case, they'd hit the G key again to indicate that it also points right. In an incongruent trial, they would also respond to each arrow. So the first arrow would appear, and they'd have to hit the J key to indicate that it points up. And when the second arrow appeared, they'd have to hit the N key to indicate that it points down. Okay? And we give them about a second or so of a blank screen to respond to the first arrow before the second arrow appears. And this is a pretty easy task, so that turns out to be pretty workable. Now, the interesting result is that we get a phenomenon called this congruency sequence effect. And what you can see here is that we're measuring mean probe reaction time. That is how quickly people respond to the second arrow in each trial. And I think what you can see is that they respond more quickly to the second arrow if the trial is, let's put it this way. If the previous trial was congruent, like this on the left, then people respond to the second arrow in the current trial more quickly if the current trial is also congruent than if the current trial is incongruent. In contrast, if the previous trial was incongruent, like this one on the top right, then people respond to the second arrow in the current trial if the current trial is also incongruent, like the one on the top right, as compared to if it's congruent. So that is to say that it seems as if performance is better when congruency repeats across two consecutive trials as compared to when congruency changes across two consecutive trials. So that is, if we measure how long it takes, once again, people to respond to the second arrow or the probe in each trial, we find that they are faster to respond to that probe in a congruent trial if the previous trial was also congruent. Then whereas if the previous trial is incongruent, now they're faster to respond to the probe if the current trial is also incongruent. Questions on this? Okay. So there's competing accounts of this congruency sequence effect that I wanted to distinguish, and I thought the force-sensitive keyboards would be really helpful. So the first account says that control processes, cognitive control processes, develop a kind of expectation that the congruency will repeat in the next trial. So if the previous trial was congruent, I expect the next one to be congruent. If the previous trial was incongruent, I expect the next one to be incongruent. And what they do is they modulate the response cued by the prime before the target appears. So we can think about this as modulating the response cued by the prime before the probe appears. So let's think about this. After a congruent trial, the idea is that people in the current trial might see an up arrow. They then press J, right, for up, that's this key. And then they do that within about 400 milliseconds. And after that, they say, hey, I'm going to get ready for the probe, okay? But because the previous trial was congruent, I expect a probe that will be congruent to this prime. That is, because the prime pointed up, I'm expecting that the probe will also point up. How do I get ready for that? Oh, I know. I'll start pushing on the up key because I think that the upcoming arrow will point up and I'll have to hit this J key to indicate that it points up. Or, yeah, okay. After an incongruent trial, I would still press the J key, right, to indicate that the prime arrow points up. But now I'm thinking, wait a minute, last time it was incongruent, like left followed by right. Now I see up, I'm thinking it's going to be incongruent too, so that would be down. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to inhibit myself from pressing the up key, or maybe I'm going to start pushing on the down key to prepare. So this response modulation account, you may notice, is saying that stuff is happening before the probe appears. There's all this getting ready and pushing on different keys before the actual second arrow stimulus appears. In contrast, the congruency switch account says all the action happens after the probe appears, not before. So here, the idea is that control processes have to reconfigure the system to employ different encoding processes only after the probe appears. So what's the idea? Say the previous trial was incongruent, like there was a left arrow followed by a right arrow. Now the current trial has an up arrow followed by a down arrow. So you can use the same encoding processes to encode that there were two different stimulus representations involved, like up and down or left and right in the previous trial, and two different responses. In contrast, if the current trial is congruent, then there's only one stimulus representation that has to be encoded and one response. And that's different than what happened in the previous trial. There were two stimulus representations and two responses if the previous trial was incongruent. And because of this difference, you have to use different encoding processes to encode the current trial. And that slows you down because congruency is changing. And the idea then is that this slowdown is occurring, though, only after the probe appears. Because it's only after the probe appears that you know whether the current trial is congruent or incongruent. You can't know that until the probe appears. And so these congruency switch costs are only happening after the probe appears, according to this account. And so, like I mentioned before, we get this congruency sequence effect, but it can be explained equally well by the response modulation account and by the congruency switch account. And so I thought, how am I going to get at this issue? Well, I thought, let your fingers do the walking. I have these force-sensitive keyboards. Let your fingers tell us what's going on. So I tried to make a study with force-sensitive keyboards to distinguish these accounts. And to do this, I measured anticipatory response activation after participants responded to the prime, but still 200 milliseconds before the probe appeared. Okay, so that is to say, if you go back here, I'm measuring response activation in this little interval right here, in the 200 milliseconds before this stimulus appears. Okay, so I'm measuring here, and I'll show you that in a second. So the response modulation account, as I explained earlier, predicts that people are pushing on these buttons like crazy before the probe appears. Okay, so there should be more pre-probe force on the key cued by the prime after a congruent trial, but on the opposite key maybe after an incongruent trial. So in other words, after a congruent trial, left, left, now you see the up arrow, and you're thinking, oh, the second stimulus, the probe, will require me to push the up key again. And so I'm starting to push on that key, the up key, which is the one cued by the prime, right? Because the prime is the arrow pointing up. I'm starting to push on that if the previous trial is congruent. But if the previous trial was incongruent, like left, right, now I see up and I think, oh, the probe's going to be down. So I start pushing on the opposite key. The prime is an up arrow, but I start pushing on the down key to get ready for the probe. Critically, the congruency switch cost, as I mentioned before, doesn't make any of these predictions because it says those congruency switch costs only happen after the probe appears. So it doesn't make any predictions about systematic changes in response activation varying with previous trial congruency, et cetera, before the probe appears. Is this clear to everybody, this logic, or are there any questions? I see Phoebe nodding. That's my barometer. If Phoebe nods, then I think it's clear. Okay, so there are 24 healthy undergraduates. And by the way, I just want to mention, I brought them into the lab to do this experiment. I didn't tell them anything about force-sensitive keys. I just said, and I called the IRB. It's like, do I have to do something special? And they were just like, is it a keyboard? I was like, yeah, but it's measuring these force things. They're like, is it a keyboard? I said, well, yes, but it's measuring. Is it a keyboard? I was like, well, it's a keyboard. They're like, you don't have to do anything. So I didn't tell them, because I didn't want to bias them. But I got 24 healthy undergrads because some power analyses suggested that would be more than sufficient. They came in and did this 1-hour session. I replicated the very large congruency sequence effect in mean RT that I showed you before, including the fact that all these little simple effects that I showed you before, right? And now I'm going to show you what the force measures look like, because I think this is the most revealing part. So what I'm plotting here is force in centinewtons on the y-axis, time since prime onset, that's the first arrow in each trial, on the x-axis, here's 0 over here. And then you can see that within the plot, there's 2 lines, okay? The solid line is when the previous trial was congruent, and the dashed line is when the previous trial was incongruent, okay? And moreover, you can see I'm making this plot separately for what I'm calling the prime congruent key that I referred to earlier. That's just the key that subjects press when the prime appears. And the prime incongruent key, that's just the key that indicates the opposite direction. So like if the prime points up, then the prime congruent key would be the J key, which is for up, and the prime incongruent key would be the N key, which is for down. So that's what I'm plotting in these figures. And what I wanted to note to you is that our measure of pre-probe force is this 200 millisecond interval just before the probe appears. Okay. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, and I've blown it up actually in this little sub box here so you can see it more clearly. Now you might say, well, wait, how come there's this huge increase in force around 400 milliseconds on the prime congruent key, but not on the prime incongruent key? Well, that's because we tell subjects to respond to the prime as well as to the probe. So what we're seeing here is the force associated with responding to the prime, right? So when people actually push the J key to indicate the prime points up, force goes way up. Now, it may look to you as if it's smooth and kind of, it almost looks like a hemodynamic response in imaging, right? It looks kind of smooth, but if you actually look at trial by trial measures of force, they are really like just spikes, right? People just like quickly kind of go up. So they're not total spikes, but they're much narrower. And it's only because we average across trials with different reaction times that this gets a little more smooth. So it's much narrower. Interestingly, you can see that when people respond to the prime, say by hitting the up key, it looks like on the prime incongruent key, force goes down a little bit. It's almost like pushing, if you put your right middle finger on the J key now and your right index finger on the N key and just push the J key, you might feel your index finger kind of going up off of the N key. Okay, so that might just be a biomechanical effect of making one response with one finger, your adjacent finger goes up a little bit. So that might explain this dip. But the most important thing that I want you to look at here is the pre-probe force. And I think what you can see is that on the prime congruent key, that is, for example, in this example, if the prime points up and the prime congruent key would be the J key, you can see there's more force on that key just before the probe appears if the previous trial was congruent, like left-left, than if the previous trial was incongruent, like left-right. And this suggests that when the previous trial was incongruent, subjects like left, subjects see the up key, the up arrow, they push the up key, that's the prime congruent key, so force goes way up. Then, though, force comes back down, but as they're preparing for the upcoming probe, they say, wait a minute, the last trial was congruent, this one's going to be congruent too, so get ready to push the up key again, because I think the probe will point up as well, just like the prime did. And you can see this increase in force when the previous trial was congruent on the prime congruent key. In contrast, we see exactly the opposite on the prime incongruent key. Here what you see is that if the previous trial was incongruent, like left-right, now subjects respond to the up arrow, prime, in the current trial, just like I showed you back here. But after they respond, it appears that there's greater force on the prime incongruent key, right? When that previous trial was incongruent as compared to congruent. So if it's left-right in the previous trial, you see the up arrow in the current trial, now you're getting ready for down. Now you're starting to push on the N key. And so you see that if the previous trial was incongruent, this dashed line here, you're starting to push harder on the N key than if the previous trial was congruent. Now, I've condensed this for you. If we just average across, average force from this 933 millisecond to 1133 millisecond interval. So I'm just going to average all the points, because I remember, I think I told you that I'm polling at 200 hertz. So in this 200 millisecond interval, I'm getting 40 data points. And when you average things, that's what I'm presenting down here. What you can see is that on the prime congruent key, there's more force when the previous trial was congruent as compared to incongruent. It's here. But on the prime incongruent key, there's more force when the previous trial was incongruent as compared to congruent. And so this suggests exactly what I mentioned to you back here, I think, which is that this is what's going on. That subjects, after they respond to the prime, right, they press J for up, they say to themselves, oh, I'm going to get ready for the probe. And if the previous trial is congruent, like left, they go, wait, I am expecting another congruent trial. And so since the probe required an up response, the prime required an up response, the probe will too. So get ready to start pushing on that J key again. Whereas after an incongruent trial, they're doing the opposite. They're saying, don't push on J, start getting ready by pushing on N. So let's see. So we concluded in this one study that by tracking anticipatory response activation, we could find evidence for this response modulation account over the congruency switch account. And I just want to point out that very locally, I think it would be interesting to look at how these expectations or memory control interactions, like my memory of the previous trial's congruency, is somehow influencing how I pay attention and my cognitive control in the current trial. What is the nature of these interactions? Like what's going on? And one possibility is that there's some kind of incremental learning based on recent events, like Matt Jones and his colleagues have suggested. Something else more exciting is that there could be some kind of either conscious or maybe implicit expectation or prediction about when congruency repetitions or alternations might occur. And that's kind of what I've been implicating so far, that some kind of expectation that the subject has might be driving these effects. So I actually reported an exploratory analysis in this paper that supports the idea that control processes make predictions. Now, earlier I said to you that we kind of switch between horizontal and vertical arrows in odd and even trials of each block, and I said we'd come back to that later. And this means that subjects are kind of switching between pushing the two left keys with their left hand and the two right keys with their right hand, in odd and even trials of each block. So in trials 1, 3, and 5, they're always doing one of the two left keys, and in trials 2, 4, and 6, they're always doing one of the two keys with their right hand. And this gave us an opportunity to kind of figure out, are subjects anticipating, even before the trial starts, which keys they're going to have to use in that trial? And if so, that might be evidence that they're making some kind of prediction. And sure enough, if you measure force before the prime appears, even before the trial starts, you see that people are exerting more force on the keys they're going to have to use in the next trial than on the keys they just used in the previous trial. And so it seems like people are getting ready to respond with the keys that they're going to have to use in the upcoming trial, and they're maybe abandoning the keys that they just used in the previous trial because they know those aren't relevant anymore. And this suggests that perhaps, or at least it's consistent with the idea, that predictions could be underlying some of the effects we're measuring in our main experiment. Those predictions might be about congruency repetitions. When will they occur? These are just about like, you know, alternations between different keys on the keyboard with whether the trial is odd or even, right? But I think they're still suggestive. So in conclusion, I just think it'd be exciting to look at whether force measures could explore anticipatory response activation in lots of contexts. So like, I'm interested in what kinds of predictions drive these anticipatory effects. Are they conscious or unconscious? Lots of times my subjects, this is really weird, but my subjects will come out of experiments and I'll ask, oh, were you predicting anything? And they'll say, oh, in the beginning, I was always predicting if the last one was congruent, the next one would be congruent, something like that. And then they say, but after a while, I realized it was random and I stopped predicting. And then I say to them, oh, well, what about your fingers? Were they moving? And they go, yeah, they were moving. And I said, well, did they stop moving? And they go, no. Like my fingers kept moving, predicting, but my brain wasn't. I was like, what do you mean? Like, I don't know. I knew it was random, but I kept getting ready for the congruent or incongruent thing. And so I think that dissociation is kind of interesting. It could also be interesting to look at like whether these anticipatory effects are influenced by attention or working memory, or as I intimated earlier, whether they vary across different subject populations, right? Just like those other measures of response-related processing, like initiation time and curvature appear to do. I think in other tasks, it could be quite interesting to look at this. Like you can cue people to make a left or right response or an up or down response. You can measure, like just like in spatial cueing paradigms, you can track how people prepare to make a response over time with these kinds of devices. You could look at sequence learning, like are people starting to anticipate the next button they're going to have to press, even if it's unconscious, like in the serial reaction time task, long sequences of trials that subjects can't consciously report, but nonetheless they're learning them and getting ready. I think response inhibition could be really interesting to look at here. For example, in the go, no, go task, we often think that when people don't hit the key in a no-go trial, that they've fully inhibited the response, but I wonder if they're tapping on the key, and if knowing which subjects are tapping or not might be helpful. Like maybe people with ADHD tap a whole lot more than people without, who knows? But you can get all of these sort of sub-threshold button pressing response activations with devices like these. I just want to point out, like I said before, some of these force measures have some nice advantages over other measures of response activation, like reach and mouse tracking, or EMG and EEG and fMRI. And those are that you can really easily distinguish multiple finger-specific response activations on the same hand. And I think that's cool, like, because in our cognitive psychology tasks, we often require to use two fingers on the same hand to actually respond to the stimuli. And so being able to dissociate response activation for each finger is cool. I also want to point out that these kinds of devices have much higher signal-to-noise ratio than many other techniques, like EEG. This might be hundreds to 1,000 times greater signal-to-noise ratio than something like EEG. And again, they're not totally cheap, but they're relatively inexpensive in comparison to these other devices. I think when I was creating them, a box, I might have gotten it down to about, I don't know, I forget, somewhere between $500 and $1,000 for a box, something like that. They also have some limitations though. So obviously these sorts of boxes aren't sensitive to all forms of response preparation. You can be preparing to make a response and measure that with the lateralized readiness potential, even if you're not starting to push on a particular button. And these keyboards would not measure that. They don't tell us anything about neural processes, right? So if you want to know about that, you're going to have to use fMRI or EEG. But as I've hopefully convinced you today, I think they can still be useful for distinguishing between different theories and models of behavior, and for getting some idea of what's going on. So finally, I just want to acknowledge I had some internal funds from the university, help from the electronic services shop in chemistry, people from LSAIT who help program software that makes the keyboards communicate with MATLAB, and just everybody in all the students in my lab who gave lots of great feedback on this project. So thanks very much. I went on a little too long, right? but I'd be really curious to hear what people think. what your thoughts are.
Yeah, really interesting. Thanks so much, Daniel. I'll open it up for questions. You can type in the chat and Daniel and I will read it, or feel free to raise your hand. Oh, we've got one. Dave, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, love to hear from you.
Pardon me, somebody just came to my house and I had on my mask, but just bear with me. Yeah, I actually have two questions. One hard, one easy. I ask the hard one first, and depending on how it goes, maybe the easy one. So, Daniel, question is, for this particular audience, what's the most important idea, thing, or whatever that you think we ought to take away? And would it be different for Phoebe than for us?
Great. So, well, I think the most important thing to take away is that we can just learn a lot more about cognition by following the journey of a key press than just by, pushing by the final reaction time and error rate. So I think there's just more information we can learn by studying how a response evolves over time. And I think for Phoebe, or maybe social psychologists in general, people study things like implicit attitude tests, like, are you going to, measure somebody's, ability to categorize things and how it's different? There's all kinds of like tasks, I think, in social psychology where people are kind of using response times to make inferences about kind of attitudes or implicit attitudes, or all sorts of things that could be measured, I think, better with these sorts of keys. People in the IAT might push one key, for example, but even though they were possibly planning to push the other key beforehand. So that might be something that could apply to the field of social psychology.
Okay, so the easy question is, how do I then go about doing all this on MTurk?
You don't, because on MTurk, you can't measure force, because there you have to rely on subjects' own keyboards. You have to come to a laboratory to do that.
Thank you.
I think, David, I think you had your hand up next.
Thanks. Great talk, Daniel. Since subjects weren't aware of the force-sensitive nature of the keyboards, do you think, or I guess, how do you think that they're starting out their hand position on each trial? Are they actively putting any pressure? Is it resting there? Because I'm wondering if you can enhance some of these effects, particularly the inhibition effects, if they're required to be under a little bit of weight, so that they start each trial and the trial won't actually begin until they hit a mark of being X amount of pressure is applied. And then you might get more subtle effects, because I'm wondering some of the differences with TMS, motor potentials, are that those can be really sensitive to very small patterns of activity. Here, if they're resting fully, they still need to make some initial action, as opposed to if they're already under a little duress or pressure.
Oh, so you're saying that they should be pushing down a little bit?
Yeah, they have a threshold that the trial won't begin until they've reached 80 centinewtons or something.
Yeah, I initially for this study, I just wanted to do it the same exact way that I do behavioral reaction time studies, where I don't instruct subjects to start with some pressure. It is possible that doing what you say would even enhance the sensitivity of these keyboards. And actually, I've built into the software the ability to track. I think I mentioned that we save out the force-sensitive data as the experiment goes on, but I can query it during the experiment, and I can even say, give me the last 50 or 40 or 20, n samples of force data, and I'm getting, 200 per second, and I can say, if the average force is this or not this or whatever, give an error message or do all kinds of things. So it's really possible to interactively change the task as a function of what the subject is pushing or how hard they're pushing, etc. So yeah, that's totally possible. Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Awesome. Phoebe?
Okay, your actual sequence of congruent and incongruent stimuli was random, right?
Yes.
What do you think would happen if it worked? If you had every other one, for example, do you think that subject could learn that and do the opposite?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what you're suggesting is we could bias the subject to expect either a congruency repetition if we had multiple congruents in a row or multiple incongruents in a row, or a congruency alternation if we switched back and forth between congruent and incongruent. And yes, so I guess I don't know what would happen, but I suspect that if subjects caught on to that, we might be able to measure changes in this pre-probe force that reflect the fact that they can predict whether the next trial will be congruent or incongruent. So that would be, yeah, that would totally be possible to do.
Right. Thanks.
Awesome. And John?
Daniel, let's set aside for a moment the effect on the sequence of trials. Your data are really beautiful, by the way. I'm interested in what the microscopic processes are on a single incongruent trial. That is, suppose you did a flanker task where it's the central arrow is either congruent or incongruent with the flanking arrows, and now you measure the time course of the response preparation for whatever the final response lands up being. Can you show, for example, that on incongruent trials, subjects are seduced into starting to push the wrong button, and then they inhibit that and then push the correct button?
I have not shown that in this particular task, but many other studies using EMG have already shown that sort of effect. And so this task wasn't designed for that because the prime and the probe were separated by a whole second. And we sort of separated the response-related processing for each one. But many studies have used EMG to show exactly what you're saying. And so I suspect that if we have the distractor and target closer together in time, there would be some trials where people begin to push on the wrong button. Definitely.
Great. And Dave?
Yes, I just have a quick question, which is that your specific talk or data focused on anticipatory responses. But I assume you still preserve all the types of data, for example, that you can, or trends that you see, for example, in a mouse tracking measure, for example. And I have to admit, the reason I'm interested in is that I can be intrigued by situations where people face a decision, but they want to avoid the decision. That is, it's a taboo topic, or it's something with high consequence or high conflict. And so you could literally potentially watch people try to escape a decision or resist a decision. But really what I want to do is you just want to confirm that all the other data that you get with other measures, or trends you can see with other measures, you can gather with this force sensitivity measure too.
So force can follow, you can track force throughout the duration of a trial. And so, yes, you can, I think you would, in this case, have to compute curvature by subtracting activation from like the left finger minus the right finger, because it wouldn't be a natural consequence of just having one hand that moves in one direction or the other. But I think if you took a difference, that you could get a measure of curvature. I will say that these particular keyboards are optimized for looking at anticipatory activity. The strain gauges are really delicate because I wanted to track the anticipatory activity and make it very sensitive. So the encasing of the keyboard, the actual blue encasing, stops people from pushing the key down as soon as it actuates. They can't keep going. But I think even there, one could get measures of things like velocity and acceleration that would correlate strongly with probably final force. So I think these keyboards have it. I think if not, there's actually a company now that is starting to look into building these, and I've been communicating with them, and theirs may provide even better measures of force throughout the duration. But these do also provide that, and so I think you would get many of the same measures.
Well, great. We're coming up on time here. So as long as Daniel's okay with sticking around for a few minutes, we can take these last few questions. Great. But if you have to sign off, we can completely understand. Thanks for joining us. And like I said at the beginning, look for our methods hour scheduled for the winter coming out soon. And if you want to be on it, please email me.